David. I'm a fellow at the Project 2049 Institute, and it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Randy Shriver, the president and CEO of Project 2049. He is also a founding partner at Armitage International, and among other roles, he was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And let's welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, and good afternoon and welcome. It's my pleasure to open our proceedings here today. As Emily said, I'm Randy Shriver, president of the Project 2049 Institute, and happy to welcome you to what I think is going to be a very important discussion and an important event. You know, as an institute, we have sustained attention and research efforts on the security environment in the Taiwan Strait, whereas maybe for much of Washington, it's more episodic. But I would suggest that this is a particularly good time to look at these issues. The president has just finished a trip where he articulated a vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Those words and those concepts certainly, to me, suggest there should be a key role for Taiwan. We have the conclusion of the 19th Party Congress in China. Some speculation that Beijing and the CCP may take a harder line toward Taiwan coming out of those events. We have some interesting things going on in the PLA. In fact, it's a bit shocking that more attention hasn't been paid to the level of purging of the military. Over 100 senior colonel or flag officers and above have been purged. That's a pretty remarkable thing, and I think any other country, that's all we'd be talking about, but somehow this has been relatively low-key in China. But it suggests something consequential is going on in the military, and how that may impact their posture, their behavior towards Taiwan is of interest to us. So I personally look forward to this discussion very much. We have an outstanding panel, people that I'm sure are familiar to folks in this audience. But before we turn to that excellent panel, I have the honor of introducing our opening speaker, Ambassador James Lee. Ambassador Lee has a long and distinguished career serving his country, the Republic of China. If you look at his bio, certainly he has great expertise on the U.S. and U.S.-Taiwan relations. But if you look more fully at his bio, he's done African affairs, he's done a lot of European affairs, he's been involved in Pacific Island affairs. I just learned he was in Hawaii for 7 or 8 years, but during that time was working on different parts of the Pacific. So a very, I think, diverse career, but again, a lot of time spent in the United States. We overlapped in Hawaii when I was at Barber's Point and he was at Taipei's mission in Honolulu. But we're really fortunate to have somebody with this breadth of experience and depth of knowledge to open our conference today. So we very much look forward to Ambassador Lee's remarks on U.S.-Taiwan relations and the security environment. Please help me welcome Ambassador James Lee.
Thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Randy, for your kind introduction. First of all, I would like to congratulate Randy for your smooth Senate confirmation hearing weeks ago. I look forward to work closely with you to further enhance Taiwan-U.S. security relations. And meanwhile, I would like to thank Project 2049 Institute for organizing this distinguished panel to discuss this critical topic, and I feel honored to be invited to make this opening remark. More than 70 years ago, out of the ash of World War II, the America and its allies and partners choose to build an open and free rule-based international order. These ideas have changed the fortunes of Asia forever. An unprecedented era of peace and stability has enabled hundreds of millions of Asians to lift themselves out of poverty and transform Taiwan from a small agricultural economy to a global high-tech hub and vibrant democracy. Today's Taiwan, a beacon of democracy in the Pacific, has become a reliable and vital partner of the United States in safeguarding this shared value and principle. The security of Taiwan is central to the security of the broader Asia Pacific. Thus, none of us should take the security of Taiwan for granted. We have marshaled our power and our influence. We have borne the costs and the sacrifice, and we stay true to the principle that brought us to this fortunate moment in history. Over the decades, the United States has been steadfast in supporting Taiwan's self-defense capability to resist the use of force and other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security and socio-economic system of Taiwan. In June, the administration notified the Congress of the $1.4 billion arms sales to Taiwan, the first of its kind under President Trump. In addition, the NDAA 2018, passed by the U.S. House and the Senate earlier this month, underscored the strong bipartisan support and commitment to fulfilling both the letter and spirit of the TRA remain as solid as ever. The security challenge facing Taiwan today is obvious and imminent. To protect its lifestyle and its peace and prosperity, Taiwan intends to increase its investment in defense, commensurate with the security challenge it faces, while strengthening its partnership with other like-minded countries. Taiwan will continue to position itself in line with the United States' Grand Indo-Pacific strategy whenever possible. President Tsai has vowed to boost Taiwan's defense budget based on our GDP growth rate, at least by 2% annually for the next 10 years. If an extra arms sales package is accepted, an additional 1% growth will be allocated for that purpose. If the United States offers an even bigger package that we need, we will use a special reserve budget. All of this demonstrates our commitment not only to our self-defense, but also to our shared responsibility to safeguard peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States has an abiding interest in cross-strait peace and stability. And for the past 6 decades, Taiwan and the United States security cooperation has helped undoubtedly maintain the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We believe a Taiwan that is secure, confident, and free from coercion is better able to engage Beijing constructively. Such engagement, in turn, supports a stable and peaceful cross-strait environment. The Indo-Pacific environment is dynamic and changing rapidly. President Trump, throughout his recent trip to Asia, called for the promotion of a free, open, international order based on the rule of law, freedom from coercion, and open market access. Taiwan, as a responsible stakeholder in the region, is willing to work closely with other like-minded countries, in particular the United States, and make a contribution to this grand strategy. In summary, a strong, secure, prosperous, and confident Taiwan is fundamentally in the United States' interest and important for the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. We appreciate the long-standing U.S. support and commitment to Taiwan's self-defensive capability to resist coercion and deter aggression, which help preserve Taiwan's freedom, democracy, and stable cross-strait relations. In closing, let me once again thank the Project 2049 Institute for hosting this panel. And I wish you all a great success in today's event and a fruitful discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee, for those important remarks and for spending your afternoon with us today. Now we're going to move into our first panel, Strategic Deterrence, U.S.-Taiwan Security Relations, with a distinguished panel of guests. So let's welcome them to the floor.
All right, we all settled. Thank you everyone for joining us on for this first panel today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're about to have on U.S.-Taiwan security relations. We're really at a moment in time where a lot more can be done, I think, in the relationship. We have a lot of good sense of Congress, a lot of language in the Senate discussing the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and what more can occur when it comes to mill-to-mill relations as well as high-level engagement. So this really is a great opportunity, near the close of the 2017 year, to really take a closer look at this issue and see what could potentially be in store for next year's and the next years to come. My name is Rachel Burton. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Project 2049 Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome this panel. We have Rupert Hammond Chambers, who's the President of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council. We have Anish Goel, who is the Senate Armed Service, who's Staff Director of the Senate Armed Service Committee, but is also a Senior Fellow at New America. And we have Tiffany Ma, who is the Senior Director for Political and Security Affairs. I think that's right. Yeah, Political and Security Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and Mark Stokes, who's the Executive Director of the Project 2049 Institute. So to kind of kick off this first panel, one thing that I really wanted to highlight was something that was in David Helvey's remarks at the U.S.-Taiwan Business Conference earlier this year. David Helvey, who's the current acting assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia-Pacific Affairs, talked about there being a common goal, that he defined the United States and Taiwan's common goal as having a credible and visible deterrent to potential coercion and aggression against Taiwan. So with a common goal established, the United States and Taiwan must seek innovative and cooperative initiatives to develop latent interoperability and a cohesive deterrent to maintain peace and stability in the region. So my hope is that our panelists here and the questions that our audience can pose is really trying to flesh out some of the opportunities and the challenges in terms of strengthening U.S.-Taiwan relations and really trying to find more latent interoperability between the U.S. and Taiwan. So to start us off, I would like to ask Mr. Hammond Chambers to kind of discuss the U.S.-Taiwan defense industry cooperation. What are the opportunities and the challenges that exist as Taiwan's defense industry itself is looking to become more established and become more a part of the global defense supply chain? What are some of the challenges that exist there? I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you for this opportunity, Randy, to speak at the Project 2049 Institute. And James, thank you for your remarks. The importance of self-reliance when no one, bar the United States, will sell you weapons, and your primary adversary, I don't think I need to tell you who that is, has spooked even the US into downgrading what can be sold and how often it can be sold. It is a huge challenge that Taiwan faces. How do you provide for your own self-defense when nearly everybody, even your friends, don't want to sell you what you need? President Tsai was elected, obviously, it's a fact, last year. And she presented to the Taiwan people in the run-up to that election an industrial policy with 5 pillars, one of which was defense. And she argued, and in my view, persuasively, that defense not only could be, an industrial policy defense not only could be in the economic interests of the people on Taiwan, but also could provide Taiwan significant capabilities that the country was not, to this point, able to procure for itself. And we are now a year in to that policy, and the hope that that policy will, in fact, reap dividends and provide Taiwan, in some areas, capabilities and systems that it needs, as well as, and critically, for Tsai and her government, as well as, I believe, in the interests of the United States, better integrate Taiwan's small and medium-sized companies into the US defense supply chain. If you think about the technology supply chain, Apple is a company obviously very familiar to us. Apple is a systems integrator. It integrates complex devices and then sells them. But what's in our iPhones and our iPads and other devices we procure from Apple is made all over the world. Apple is simply the integrator. Some of its technology is in there. Some of it belongs to other people. It designs and it integrates. This is also true for a company like Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is a systems integrator. If you're in the market for an F-35 this Christmas, you're going to buy an aeroplane that is integrated by Lockheed, but is built all over the world in different shapes and sizes, in different pieces, and then Lockheed puts together down in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a systems integrator. Systems integration is hard. It's very hard, particularly when you're dealing with complex platforms like defense items. But Taiwan's having a go at it and has some previous success. We have the IDF program, the Indigenous Defense Fighter, or Zhangjingguo fighter, that Taiwan designed with US assistance in the 1980s and constructed and delivered in the 1990s. AIDC is the systems integrator for that platform. And I was in Taiwan last week at CCK Air Force Base in Taichung, and I had a look at them. They're doing pretty well. They're going through an upgrade program, but they're 20 years in. It's not a bad platform. Taiwan built that with assistance from the United States. It can do it. It can integrate complex systems in cooperation with a foreign partner to provide for Taiwan's national defense. That is important to recognize, that Taiwan can undertake complex programs. The Air Force at this juncture, I'm going to just touch a little bit. The Air Force, the Navy, the Army, just give you a sense of what each of them are doing, and then we're going to chat a wee bit about the US before Rachel tells me I'm done. The Air Force has got a complex program up and running right now, the Advanced Jet Trainer. It's about a $2.1 billion program. The NCSIST, as some of you may know it by, the National Chung Shan Institute for Science and Technology, is the prime contract. And the systems integration has been subcontracted to AIDC, which is a notionally private company in Taichung, closely controlled by the Taiwan government. The program is going relatively well to date, and by 2020, AIDC is expected to produce the first trainer aircraft for testing. The government has contracted for 66 of them. That number is interesting. It comes up a lot in our space when you talk about Taiwan, but that's another conversation. So they've contracted for 66 of them, and it's envisaged as potentially a light fighter. When we think about the fighter market for the world, just very quickly, you have basically emerging a expensive fighter market, a middle fighter market, mid-range, and then cheap fighters, ones that are cost-effective. This would fall into the latter category, should it become a light fighter option. And Taiwan may choose to procure those, and at the very least, attempt to sell them. That is problematic, however, which is an important point I want to make to you all today. Taiwan can develop and manufacture its own platforms and systems, but where it loses out on economies of scale for production, which many other governments enjoy, is its inability for political reasons to export into the global market, even when it produces something that people would find cost effective and exactly what they're losing. China would pressure anything that became public on that front. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that the barriers for sale are significantly higher for Taiwan than they would be for any other market where there are some capabilities. Taiwan also has formidable missile development capabilities. Anti-ship, anti-air, and ballistic missiles are all capabilities that Taiwan has developed on its own, and all those capabilities are already in service with Taiwan. The Taiwan Navy announced last year a 23-year effort, about $15 billion, to build a wide range of ships, destroyers, frigates, submarines. I'm going to come back to that, and a number of other different platforms. This is an area that makes a great deal of sense for Taiwan. Taiwan already has a well-developed and mature shipbuilding industry. Taiwan can build the hulls, they can do design. They already have a fast attack boat. They've got 12 of them in service right now, and very well thought of. But the real genius of the Navy program, in my view, the reason it's so smart is that you can go into the global marketplace and you can buy subsystems for these boats that are much harder to pressure politically and give yourself a capability that's really competitive with your adversary across the Strait, particularly in deterrence, as well as equipping domestic-made munitions from NCSIST, which is the prime on their missile programs, and come up with a formidable platform. And for me, I believe that Taiwan's Navy program is going to enjoy, Navy shipbuilding program, excuse me, over the next 10 to 15 years, is going to enjoy some success, again, with US and European companies supporting Taiwan in different ways. They'll be hard to track publicly in this sort of environment, but for the prime and subprime in the defense industry world, we'll have a much better prism to look at what's going into what and providing Taiwan what kind of platform and capability. The submarine program is one that we've been grappling with. We had an opportunity in 2003 and 2004 to consummate it. That was blocked by the KMT's blocking of the defense budget. And again in 07-08, when the Taiwan government and the US could not agree on the down payment for phase one, the design phase, and a second opportunity was lost to move forward on building a submarine. We now have an indigenous submarine program up and running, but Taiwan remains very interested in ensuring some sort of role for the United States, given the complexities of systems integration here. We are stuck, frankly, on this program with the US government unwilling at this juncture to grant licenses to several US companies to process and engage with Taiwan in the early stages of design. And until that changes, Taiwan's submarine program isn't going anywhere, quite frankly, in my opinion. My example for the Army program is one where Taiwan can run into trouble on its indigenous aspirations. There's a wheeled vehicle called the Clouded Leopard. It's designed for the Army and the Marine Corps. It's decades in the making, and it has been problematic almost since the day it was conceived. But the political commitment to this wheeled vehicle is such that there has been tremendous pressure on the Taiwan military to procure it, even when today it still has problems in the myriad versions that the Taiwan military envisage for it. But the politics of it domestically and the relationship between the NCSIST and MND, the Ministry of National Defense, have ensured that this program has been near impossible to kill, even when it's year on year has proved problematic. We're fully familiar with that in this country. Even when there's general consensus that we should move away from a particular program, it can be very difficult to kill when you've got that nexus between the congressional branch and the executive branch and the companies that are producing it. So what role does the United States have in helping Tsai execute this vision? Well, we have a big role to play, and it can vary tremendously given the particular platform that we're talking about. In respect to the submarine, my own view is that Taiwan's ability to procure a submarine that really meets its needs is only going to come if a U.S. company is chosen as the prime systems integrator, and the U.S. has heavy involvement in design as well as construction, training, and deployment. But there are other smaller programs that the U.S. can participate in, and those programs, it can be a key piece to a platform. Again, I don't want to get too much into details, but it does not have to be many pieces. It only has to be a key piece of technology that allows Taiwan to overcome a key barrier in producing something domestically that can change the calculation of PLA planners. The missile programs come to mind. Absolutely. How can the U.S. discreetly support those programs in a way that ensures that we feel secure about what those missiles might be able to do, and provide Taiwan with a capability that can disrupt PLA planning? That's an important area for the United States, and for our policy planners to get right, not just at DoD, but at state and those who grant licenses and view support for Taiwan as important. I think finally, I just want to point out that, there are two more things I'd like to add. The first is Taiwan's ability to grow its defense industrial base isn't just going to rely on its domestic market. It's too small, quite frankly. And as I've already touched on, it's going to be very difficult for Taiwan to export any of those platforms in any meaningful way. But what Taiwan can do, and really hasn't explored, in my view, to the degree that it needs to, and this actually is true across the region for a number of Asia Pacific countries, is how do you play a role, a bit role, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 role in a US program, where you can provide support to the US prime and take a small piece of work share. You get two things. One, you get your industrial base better integrated into the US defense industrial base. And as I described earlier on, think of it just like the technology supply chain. There's a defense supply chain as well, right? Where you're integrated, where you're a trusted supplier, right? How do you get your companies integrated there to provide a high quality widget, for argument's sake, at a cost-effective price that can be used in a US platform, and that the United States can feel secure about where it's coming from and who's making it? Taiwan can and should be at the forefront of that. So how does Taiwan better position itself with some of the large programs that we're envisaging here in the United States as in my view, a tier 2 or tier 3 participant? That would require them to come up with some R&D money to assist and partner the United States in the production of the platform. But what it would get in return is its companies would then be integrated into that supply chain and take advantage of the full production line for that platform, not just for the United States, but any export potential that might potentially come from it. And additionally, Taiwan would also then have access to that platform without some of the politics that we've become so familiar with when Taiwan asks for things. So I'm going to stop here. Rachel, thank you for this opportunity.
If you really want to go on.
I'm going to leave you wanting more.
I'm happy that you brought up Taiwan being the forefront of trying to integrate its defense industry into these platforms. A lot of what the Department of Defense has been saying, and they've been trying to recommend Taiwan to really look at anti-ship cruise missiles, multiple launch rocket systems, small fast attack boats, UAVs. So I wanted to ask, are those the types of systems that currently Taiwan's industry can be involved in as a tier 2 or tier 3 supporter? Can they do anything in supporting swarm UAV technology? Is that kind of where you're going at?
Well, I actually don't have any, Taiwan's technology community that's that has traditionally supported the US tech supply chain is a huge untapped resource still to this day. Taiwan has not effectively yet integrated its non-defense companies into the defense supply chain, and I believe that their R&D units and their technologies could go into US platforms and systems because significant electronics are going into these that are taken off the shelf. Taiwan is building many of these technologies and putting them in commercial equipment. So why not defense equipment as well? That would be one good example. So I think non-traditional Taiwan defense companies for sure. And then you can look at certain areas where Taiwan enjoys some degree of expertise, some degree of global competitiveness. Missile technology is highly sensitive, but a lot of this is public knowledge. I'm not, giving you anything you can't find when you open up your laptop. But their missile technologies also could be very interesting when the United States looks at what it wants to do for missile defense, what it wants to do for land attack. So I think there are areas, and drones for sure. Taiwan does have some drone capabilities. How they fit with some of the companies that produce drones for us, I don't know. But I do know that that's a conversation worth having.
Thank you. And I wanted to also allow the rest of the panel, if you guys had any questions about anyone's presentation, please feel free to tap me or let me know. So if you guys have any questions for Rupert, just let me know. Thank you. So kind of moving on down the row here, Anish, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the NDAA and what was going on in Congress when it comes to support for U.S.-Taiwan relations. Obviously, there was a lot of talk about strengthening the defense partnership between the U.S. and Taiwan, wanting to have more high-level exchanges, more mill-to-mill relations, inviting Taiwan to naval and air exercises. Could you talk a little bit about what was going on the Hill? What was the discussions? Why is there a need to strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan relationship? And I hear that there was some kind of letter that was sent to members of Congress by the ambassador of the People's Republic of China. So I kind of would be interested to hear kind of what was going on the Hill in your own capacity. So be happy to.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, for that.
which is not an easy topic. So Tiffany, thank you for taking on this issue.
All right, thank you so much, Rachel. And before I start, I just want to thank Randy, Rachel, and Emily for the kind invitation to be here today. It's always a great privilege to be at a 2049 event and an honor to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues. So my topic today is coercion and counter-coercion. And as Rachel said, I mean, as I was trying to break down this topic of coercion, it does strike me that China is using coercion to accomplish a very clearly articulated goal, and that is one to oppose Taiwan independence and push for the long-term unification of both sides of the Taiwan Strait under the one country, two systems formula. And as part of that, we see that Beijing adheres very closely to the One China principle and, of course, the 1992 consensus as sort of guiding relations to the future that they envision. And China uses coercion to pursue its political goals, and I think there's a few reasons why it chooses to do so. First, I think there is a preference for a strategy of winning without fighting, and perhaps this is driven by uncertainty about the outcome of fighting, maybe costs imposed by the United States and Taiwan, and perhaps their own lack of confidence of a victory after seeing US power demonstrated in other parts of the world. But more importantly, I would say, is the PRC has developed leverage against Taiwan to be able to execute coercion against Taiwan during the peacetime. And we see this in the political sphere, sort of the military balance, of course, economic sphere, as well as some influence operations and psychological warfare. Of course, conflict is the highest intensity of coercion, and that is, of course, not unimaginable, as most in this room well know. But for now, it does seem that the PRC is prepared to at least defer the use of force so long as it believes that it's able to use coercion to compel Taiwan, the people in Taiwan and its leadership to move towards unification in the longer term. And if anyone argues that coercion might be too harsh of a term, I would argue that we ought to consider that Chinese actions are intended not only just to persuade the people of Taiwan and Taiwan's leadership, but also to really punish Taiwan in the cases of what they perceive as non-compliance. I will point to a few examples of Chinese use of coercion, one of which is, of course, the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. In the lead up to the Taiwan elections, Beijing conducted missile tests and military exercises essentially to both punish Li Tenghui at the time for what they saw as his pro-independence leanings, to compel the people of Taiwan to vote a certain way in the presidential election, and also to use the threat of punishment in cases of future actions towards what they saw as towards independence. And, you know, we saw in the 2005 anti-secession law that this threat of use of force to punish Taiwan has never been off the table. And it's very clear that the PRC is very willing to utilize military coercion against Taiwan for its political purposes. And to deter and punish those in Taiwan who favor independence, the coercion also manifests itself in Beijing's preference for political parties in Taiwan. We saw very clearly that the CCP prefers the moves under the KMT administration towards cross-strait integration. This period of détente was essentially a period for China to persuade the KMT and the people in Taiwan that its future lies with the mainland. And we saw there was several incentives, such as the breakthroughs in cross-strait ties, the Ma Xi meeting in Singapore in 2005. And, you know, the coercive undertone was very clearly there. The former head of the Taiwan Affairs Office said that China welcomed investments from Taiwan companies, but not those who support Taiwan independence. And I think the contrast was especially sharp in Beijing's use of coercion after Tsai Ing-wen took office, where it essentially tried to use coercion to compel her to accept the notion of one China, and also to punish her for not accepting the 1992 consensus. We saw direct coercive attempts, such as in the economic sphere, where tourism flows from the mainland to Taiwan were reduced. We saw a return of checkbook diplomacy. We saw Gambia, Panama, and Sao Tome and Principe all reinstate diplomatic relations with the PRC. And we saw Taiwan's international space becoming increasingly squeezed, where it was not invited to participate in ICAO, and the invitation to participate in the World Health Assembly was delayed. Official cross-strait dialogue was cut as punishment, and we saw increasingly enhanced military activity by the PLA around Taiwan, both in terms of the bomber flights, aircraft carrier passages through, including on the eastern side of Taiwan, and exercises simulating the storming of the presidential palace. So in that sense, we see now that coercion is kind of the new normal in cross-strait relations. And the bottom line is very much that Beijing would be very willing to use coercion to deter independence in Taiwan and punish steps that people in Taiwan might take towards that. And we're also seeing that Beijing is increasingly honing its coercive strategy. It has much more coercive tools in its toolbox than it had previously. And while coercion is sort of a dynamic balance, it's important to think about the PRC's more willing and capable use of coercion. And that's not to say that this alone would guarantee the PRC's success of its coercion strategy. Taiwan's resiliency here is also very important to consider. And while Taiwan is certainly vulnerable to certain kinds of PRC pressure, it is also resilient. And I just want to briefly talk about the two kinds of resiliencies that I see. There is a sense of almost of an innate resiliency in Taiwan, and that is sort of changing identity and changing attitudes about unification, and sort of this confidence about Taiwan's place in the world by becoming a responsible global stakeholder. And there are also things that Taiwan is actively doing to shore up its resilience to PRC coercion. So just a few examples. In the economic sphere, while Taiwan is increasingly dependent on the economy of the PRC, with about 40% of the trade being conducted, of Taiwan's trade being conducted with China, we are seeing that Taiwan has, of course, taken steps to limit its vulnerability to Chinese economic coercion by pursuing other trading partners, for example, Singapore, New Zealand. Previously, Taiwan was very interested in becoming part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the new southbound policy of this administration is also another way that Taiwan is seeking to diversify its economic partners. And we've seen that foreign direct investment to Southeast Asia has increased from Taiwan. We've seen increased influx of tourists coming from Southeast Asia, which has sort of made up for the drop-off in tourists from the PRC. And in fact, the total number of tourists to Taiwan overall increased by over 2% last year. So we're seeing that while Taiwan's economic dependency on the mainland does create vulnerabilities, there are things that Taiwan is actively doing to be resilient. In the international space, while we're seeing almost a return to the diplomatic allies competition, Taiwan is also trying to upgrade its relationship with key partners, including the United States and Japan. And I would argue that these are extremely significant and perhaps more consequential than more symbolic formal diplomatic relationships. We've seen Taiwan and Japan upgrade at least change the names of their representative offices in each other's countries. And I think Japan is an important diplomatic and economic partner for Taiwan, and it's obviously host to a significant presence of US forces in the region. So this deepening relationship, while it doesn't make up for the loss in diplomatic allies, it nevertheless reinforces Taiwan's relationships in the region. And we've seen Taiwan trying to deepen relations with the United States as well, by contributing to U.S. efforts in several different ways, including compliance with the North Korean sanctions, which, while symbolic, demonstrates Taiwan is concerned about U.S. priorities in the region and is doing everything that it can in support of that. And in terms of the psychological resiliency, I would argue that the distinct national identity that is emerging in Taiwan and the robust democracy actually helps guard against some of the more psychological coercion that Beijing utilizes. And when you have shifting identity towards more of a unique Taiwanese identity, it makes efforts by United Front Work Department, for example, to change the hearts and minds of the young people in Taiwan much, much more difficult in the long term. When you have a robust democracy, you see that Chinese efforts to coerce Taiwan into certain election results has not had their intended impact. Taiwan's strong soft power, I would argue, is another way that it's resilient to PRC pressures, in that it helps counter this narrative of Taiwan sort of being part of this inevitable reunification with the mainland, unification rather, and I think it gives, and I think it gives people, at least for the people on Taiwan, a clear vision of a future of Taiwan's role and contributions to the international system. And these are all gains that cultivate resilience over the longer term. And I guess the last thing I want to finish up on is, while the military coercion is a very serious and growing threat, past use of military coercion, especially during the 95-96 crisis, did not have the intended effect that Beijing had wanted. And while China does have the ability to coerce Taiwan in other ways, from missile strikes to blockade operations, other things that could cause very serious damage, but these would likely, perhaps based on these psychological resiliency factors, actually harden Taiwan's stance on China, in part because of the need to sort of draw a line before China attempts at a higher level of coercion. And to counter coercion from China, Taiwan can adopt a strategy of denial, and I think it's already very much focused on credible deterrence to ensure impenetrability of the island, essentially. And as Rupert talked about, the prioritization of investments into asymmetric capabilities to complicate PLA war planning and decision-making are very much embodied in the Tsai administration's approach to indigenous development. And a more committed and more self-reliant approach to defense does send a very positive signal to the United States that Taiwan is taking defense much more seriously. It sends a very significant deterrent message to China as well, that Taiwan will not make things very easy for the mainland. Still, Taiwan needs to overcome some challenges, and these include the transition to the all-volunteer force, some of the issues with the defense budget that has previously been mentioned. But what a successful counter-coercion strategy for Taiwan looks like is one that convinces the PRC that it will not be able to inflict enough pain and damage on Taiwan to make it yield, essentially. And the United States plays a very important role in this, and a lot of that we just talked about is enshrined in the TRA, which calls for the United States to provide arms of a defensive character to Taiwan, but also to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that jeopardizes the welfare of the people in Taiwan. And in a sort of cross-strait military balance, U.S. involvement and active engagement does significantly diminish China's coercive leverage over the island. And I would say that it's important to think about countering China's coercion against Taiwan as part of a broader regional counter-coercion strategy. I think it would be helpful for the US and its allies to develop a more flexible and more tailored framework for responding to various types of Chinese coercion and assertiveness that really seek to challenge the regional order and unilaterally change the status quo. As Anish mentioned, China is changing the status quo every day. It's changing the status quo. It has changed the status quo in the South China Sea, and it's very much doing that in a cross-strait scenario. So such a framework would aim to resist incremental coercion by China, ensuring that every action by China is met with some reaction that signifies that certain behaviors are unacceptable and would incur costs to them. So I guess I want to end with the point that Ambassador Lee made, which was the security of Taiwan is really central to the security of the region. And this is why we ought to think about countering Chinese coercion as part of a broader regional counter-coercion strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what's coming out of the Trump administration, talking about the Indo-Asia Pacific region, how we want it to be free and we want it to be open. Where do you see Taiwan fitting into that? Where do you see U.S.-Taiwan cooperation in a more free and open Indo-Asia Pacific region?
Yeah, so the Indo-Pacific rhetoric, I don't think it signifies necessarily an expansion in terms of geography and how we think about the Asia Pacific. I think in terms of our military AORs, we've always conceived of the Asia Pacific as stretching to the Indian Ocean. But what I think the Indo-Pacific concept, in conjunction with what we saw in Secretary Tillerson's remarks about working with like-minded countries like India in the region, is that the Indo-Pacific concept is one that could place greater emphasis on, again, partnering with like-minded countries in terms of both allies and partners. India is not a U.S. ally. It's very much a like-minded country. There is an emphasis on this, the democratic common values that we have as well. So I think Taiwan very well plays into that framework.
And going back to counter-coercion, in your opinion, do you think current U.S. policy is well suited to partner with Taiwan on counter-coercion? And you can kind of think about that in the political, military, or the political, military, economic spaces.
Yeah, I think it is. I think within the framework of the current U.S. policy framework towards Taiwan and China, I think there's much more that can be done, even under the rubric of the Taiwan Relations Act, to strengthen relations. Fundamentally, U.S. plays an essential role in helping Taiwan be more resilient to Chinese coercion attempts, I think in terms of what they can do specifically, I think the deepening military-to-military relations, as we kind of talked about in the previous NDA discussion, I think that does help send the right deterrence message. And where you really want to be in terms of a counter-coercion strategy is really to change the calculus of China, and by signifying that there would be cost involved to certain actions or coercive actions that they might take. So absolutely, I think the deeper military cooperation, I think helping Taiwan expand and diversify its diplomatic partners, economic partners, all that encourages resiliency over the longer term.
Thank you. And on that vein, Mark, I wonder if you could, and Tiffany and Anish and Rupert have all touched on this a little bit, talking about strengthening U.S.-Taiwan relations, needing deeper partnerships, that U.S. and Taiwan are really well equipped to work closer together. So I wonder if you can dive a little bit more into the idea of symbolism and substance in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and maybe perhaps operationally, where can the U.S. and Taiwan work together to be more cohesive on defense industry cooperation, or be more cohesive on counter-coercion in the economic or cultural spaces. But also, I know you've been working on U.S.-Taiwan security for a very long time, so also please expand on my questions and take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. And also appreciate your hard work and work of our staff for putting on this event today. Appreciate that. Let me start off just addressing one of your questions right head on right from the very start. And then from there work toward a general discussion of U.S. interests and the security situation in the Taiwan Strait. You mentioned the word symbolism, and you'll hear that criticism come up quite a bit. For example, port calls, U.S. Navy port calls to Taiwan would be purely symbolic, or Taiwan's dispatch of observers for RIMPAC or other U.S. exercise would be purely symbolic. Every once in a while, you will hear U.S. Assistance to Taiwan's indigenous submarine program would be purely symbolic, or Taiwan's investment in the submarines would be symbolic. But let's think a bit about what is symbolic. What exactly do we mean by that term? I would say symbolic, what that really means is legitimacy. Whenever we talk about something being symbolic, what that really means is that we don't want to extend legitimacy to Taiwan under its current constitutional framework, ROC, Republic of China constitutional framework. And I'll get into this symbolic versus substance issue later, but this is really at the crux of the problem, and is this issue of not viewing symbolism as substance. We tend to view the two as separate. As you mentioned before, I've been dealing with Taiwan for a long time in the Pentagon. First of all, in the Office of Secretary of Defense between 1997 and 2004. Then lived in Taiwan for 3 years. I'd lived in Beijing for the previous 3 years as well. And then after living in Taiwan for a few years, and came back to the U.S. with Randy under his gracious guidance. Been working with 2049 ever since then. One of the greatest, in my view, one of the most significant impacts that living in Taiwan had was a realization that Taiwan, under its current Republic of China constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state. And oftentimes when I talk to classes on Taiwan or Taiwanese students, or even within the Ministry of National Defense and other audiences, first question I ask is, do you believe that Taiwan, under its current ROC constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state? And without a doubt, people raise their hands. I mean, this is a no-brainer if you have a passport that says ROC and then parentheses Taiwan. It's obvious. But to Americans here in the U.S., it's not so obvious, because we have a hard time understanding the difference between objective reality, which is the ROC exists as an independent sovereign state, and recognition of it as such. And I see Garrett in the audience who can give us a good presentation on the differences between the objective existence and recognition of such. I think it's the Montevideo conference, but it is. I lived in Beijing, I lived in Taiwan, and these are two legitimate governments. I would argue, in some ways. What actually former Representative Randy Forbes, I think, put it best when he described the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. The status quo is the existence of two legitimate governments on both sides of the Taiwan Strait: an autocratic People's Republic of China and a democratic Republic of China. This is the objective reality. And one of the most significant security challenges I think the United States faces is how to bring our policy in line with objective reality. And this is not easy, particularly given some of the leverage that authorities in Beijing have over the United States increasingly. So with this as sort of the backdrop on the security situation, there's three different perspectives we can look at this from. There's the PRC perspective, there's the Taiwan perspective, and the U.S. Interest perspective. From the Chinese security perspective, there are two ways to look at their security strategy. One is geostrategic, and when you think geostrategic, you'll hear terms like first island chain, second island chain. Their interest in securing Taiwan is at a minimum to deny the access for the United States or Japan to use of Taiwan as a platform for which to launch operations against China, just for example. So you have a geostrategic perspective. You also have the perspective of political interests, or more specifically, legitimacy interests. From this perspective, Taiwan and its democratic form of government poses a significant challenge to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, they view legitimacy as a zero-sum game internationally as sort of the heart of their policy. Therefore, for example, any move that the United States makes on something that's viewed as symbolic is viewed as a detraction from the CCP's legitimacy because it actually extends legitimacy to a democracy. But these are two ways to view it. They have stated policies in the Constitution of achieving unification with Taiwan under a one country, two systems framework. What is one country, two systems? There's one China, Taiwan's part of China, and the PRC is the sole legitimate government of China. That is their narrative. This effort to be able to attain some formal agreement on that would lead to some kind of one country, two systems formula is not just cross-strait. In many ways, they are applying a principle, a desire for one country, two systems internationally, and especially here in Washington, D.C. You may not see it very clearly, but it's driving in this notion there's one China, Taiwan's part of China, and the PRC is the sole representative of China in the international community. We see it almost every day. The PLA has a significant role in this. It's important to look at the role of the PLA in the Taiwan Strait as not just purely military. Bear in mind that Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, to some extent, said that war is 70% political, 30% military. What does this mean? It means that there is a constant state of war. There is a propaganda war. There is a deterrence warfare. There is cultural warfare. There is media warfare that takes place every minute of every day. And we see it here in the United States as well. And only 30%, because if their goal, if you look at it from a legitimate perspective, if their goal is primarily political, which is to ensure formal subordination of Taiwan to under PRC authority, then there's all kinds of ways they can do this. From Taiwan's perspective, again, objective reality, to be able to there's not much that really can be done, at least in the cross-state context, in my view, that the Taiwan people, what people on Taiwan do to willfully subordinate themselves to the PRC, willfully in a formal way. And again, this goes back to what Beijing does internationally, which is trying to affect U.S. policy and others' policies. But Taiwan faces a whole range of challenges beyond military. Security is much more. Anytime you talk about security interests, is much more than just military. In many ways, what makes Taiwan today is economic development and its ability to be able to sustain economic development. This is critical, particularly in the information communication technology realm. U.S.-Taiwan relations in starting in the 60s, particularly in the 70s and 80s, was defined to some extent by military cooperation, but even more by its cooperation in the area of technology, particularly technology innovation. If you look at the history behind the establishment of the Hsinchu Science Park or Southern Science Park, establishment of a lot of their companies. Taiwan has significant security interests or security challenges, for example, demographics, aging population. There's non-traditional security challenges. For example, 2005, United Nations, there was a report that listed Taiwan as one of 2 of the most dangerous places on Earth due to natural disasters. But this also gives Taiwan a lot of opportunities. And then, of course, there's the military challenges. But let's look at the U.S. security perspective. The United States, guided by the Taiwan Relations Act and informed by the 3 joint communiques, is committed to be able to resist use of force and other forms of coercion and provide Taiwan with necessary defense articles and services. But there's another aspect of the the Taiwan Relations Act that often goes unnoticed, and that's that with U.S. law, that Taiwan shall be treated as, in terms of within according to U.S. law, which shall be treated in the same way that it was before 1979 with the TRA. This applies to U.S. law, but it's very important to keep this in mind. The TRA is mentioned before about the idea of about our U.S. policy regarding Taiwan or cross-strait more broadly is outdated and should be and undergo some sort of review. I would agree. I would agree with this, but there's only one substitute for the TRA, and that's normal diplomatic relations with both sides of the Taiwan Strait. I would advocate there's nothing that should be changed suddenly with the United States. There's no reason to change U.S. one China policy, in my view. A U.S. one China, two governments policy is something that has been discussed a lot in the past, particularly if you look at the history of the 1950s and 1960s and all the way to the 1970s. and it's something that is still an option that exists today. The all kinds of other themes related to U.S. Policy regarding Taiwan. There's criticism of Taiwan's defense budget in terms of not spending enough on defense. Of course, it'd be great if Taiwan could spend more on defense, but think about it this way. Do we really know how much Taiwan really spends on defense? We take their defense budget at face value, but we take the PRC's defense budget and we add in other parts of it. There's additional things that go in. There are extra budgetary efforts. So most estimates of PRC defense spending tend to bring in other aspects. Has this been done for Taiwan? Actually, ask how much they really spend on defense. Just looking at one aspect alone, for example, in terms of like retired officer salaries that are the different part of the defense budget. Bottom line on this is that it's okay. It'd be great if Taiwan can increase its defense budget, but if they increase their defense budget, that means less budget for other aspects of their economy that are also important, whether it's investments in economic infrastructure, investments into social welfare. Taiwan has a great national health insurance system. But there needs to be better and more innovative ways to think through how Taiwan can invest more in their defense. And there's a role that the United States can play to create an environment for them to do this. And this gets into the defense industry, some of the defense industrial issues that Rupert talked about. And also it's worth asking, how are we able to sustain our levels of defense spending? And going back to looking at defense industry and the role the defense industry plays, second and third order economic effects that are important to think through. The issue of, as Rupert mentioned, submarines and advanced fighters remain an issue. On the diesel-electric submarines, as Rupert mentioned, the key issue is license. It's just approving licenses that have been sitting at State Department for I don't know how long, and too long. This isn't hard. This is not a technical issue. It goes back to the issue, the criticism of Taiwan saying opportunity costs. If you spend money on submarines, that means you're not going to have enough money available for other things that you really need that are more substantive. Submarines are just symbolic. Well, let's look at it like this. First of all, as Ambassador mentioned before, I don't think there was an intent to fund a submarine program, particularly on the construction side, through the regular budget. It's an extra budgetary issue. But it really goes down to, when you say symbolic, again, we don't criticize Japan for its submarine. We don't call a Japanese submarine program symbolic. We don't call a South Korean submarine program symbolic. We don't call a Singapore submarine symbolic. It's only Taiwan. That's, as far as I know, it's the only political entity, I say country, that has an intent and desire to have a submarine fleet. It's the only one that we reserve criticism for, because of that's symbolic. Again, it goes back to the issue, because in my view, there's nothing that spells sovereignty like diesel-electric submarines. A country has submarines. It's not any more complicated than that. Yes, submarines have a practical application for defense, but and same thing for advanced fighters. There's other criticisms about Taiwan needing to adopt a more innovative and asymmetric means of defense. Again, let's really figure out what this means. Innovative. Did you know that Taiwan produces, on a real basis, usually is rated 3rd, 4th, or 5th in terms of real numbers on innovation patents in the United States? And that's just straight numbers. Put that on a per capita basis, then Taiwan actually has one of the most innovative societies in the world. This becomes very, very important, particularly, again, in the information and communications technology domain and U.S. interests. U.S. interests in Taiwan and U.S. interests in actually achieving some greater degree of soft balancing, some kind of balancing legitimacy in the Taiwan Strait is very important, not just for what it means in terms of U.S. principles, but also from other things. Let's look at economic interests and technology interests. We need Taiwan on our side when it comes to what Beijing is doing in terms of their economic statecraft in the United States, when it comes to technology standards. And this is something that warrants a lot more attention. With the PRC, I would argue, hijacking of sources of our intellectual property is very important, and eventually is going to have an effect on Taiwan. And then finally, wrap things up in terms of other things to think about in our overall relationship with Taiwan, in terms of 3 suggestions to consider. The first is a theme in the Taiwan Relations Act has to do with cultural and people-to-people exchanges. It's natural, and it's inherent in the nature of our unofficial relations with Taiwan. We have, or have had in the past, a high-level consultative mechanism with Beijing on people-to-people relations, headed by Liu Yendong, member of the Politburo on the Beijing side, and then under the Obama administration, vice president. With Taiwan, why don't we have a similar mechanism with Taiwan? Something that pulls together what we have, and have it headed on the U.S. side by a senior official that can help mobilize the bureaucracy in order to be able to deepen and broaden our relations with people of Taiwan, in a very similar way that we've done with Beijing. Number two, just to echo what Rupert said, supply chain issues is something to be taken very, very seriously in the United States as a U.S. interest, particularly in the information and communications technology realm. When you look, you may have a phone, maybe an Apple, that says made in China. Bear in mind, at least up until now, that phone is actually made in a Taiwanese, or assembled in a Taiwanese factory in China. And most of those components in that phone are most likely, in terms of contract, in terms of a detailed design, are from Taiwan, manufactured in China. There's a lot of there's a lot of our components that go into our own weapon systems, and that are made in China, are made that are designed. That Taiwan plays a very critical role in U.S. supply chain, but it's very difficult to get our arms around exactly what Beijing is doing to try to cut this off. And something that warrants greater attention. And then final remark, the issue of regular normalized arms sales process is important. And I would say that the manifestation of this should be to bring back the U.S.-Taiwan annual arms sales talks, where there's a formal venue for senior representatives from Taiwan to present their requests, list of requests, and the U.S. take this back and review the requests and provide an answer within a reasonable amount of time, say 3 months. And to me, this is a critical thing. So I'll turn it back over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Mark. I wanted to ask, and this is kind of open to this entire panel before I allow a great audience to ask a few questions. Could you talk about the mill? I want to talk about mill-to-mill, U.S.-Taiwan mill-to-mill, and where are areas that there could be better coordination or cooperation in terms of exercises or training. I know that Taiwan Air Force, ROC Air Force does, they have F-16 trainings at Luke Air Force Base. What more can be done, in the Army and the Marine Corps, and in the Navy? I open it up to anyone here.
We take an initial, as I mentioned before, one of the is one of the non-obvious things, and again, it goes back to supply chain and defense industrial cooperation. In my view, there should be some kind of a committee established that includes representatives from U.S. defense industry, as well as other parts of U.S. private sector, as well as senior government, to be able to get more attention and support Taiwan's programs that they have domestically, understanding the link between defense industry, jobs, spinoffs on Taiwan, and a willingness of Taiwan people to be able to invest more in defense.
I kind of want to play off what Mark, to keep hammering the point that Mark's making. This issue of supply chain vulnerability, I made a pitch for Taiwan being more involved in the U.S. defense industry supply chain, primarily because I believe that it's in the interest of the United States to have trusted partners in that supply chain. And that's an interesting term to use because there's something in the U.S. called the Trusted Foundry Program, where our military, military and its contractors commission chips to be constructed from trusted foundries. The production of semiconductor chips, highly dynamic, highly skilled, and it's highly globalized, but centered around a number of key manufacturers. One monster happens to be Taiwan. Chinese are trying to get into the game though. So while I'm advocating for something for a trusted partner, I want to reinforce the point that Mark is making, that there are tremendous vulnerabilities here that are not fully understood. If there is a blockade scenario in the Taiwan Strait, the tech supply chain will halt. And our companies don't carry in their warehouses a year's worth of bits and bobs to put together to produce this stuff. They manage their supply chains very tightly. Supply chains will stop very, very quickly. More directly in response to your question, Rachel, I just have one sort of parochial but important point. I believe since Chip Gregson, the former Marine General, retired as Assistant Secretary of the Defense Department, Taiwan policy has mostly been directed by the Taiwan desk officer. We really need, and I believe it's coming, we really need an elevation of attention to the relationship that goes beyond the working level. I'm not saying there aren't excellent people at the working level. There are. We're blessed. But that doesn't cut it when you get higher up and you're trying to balance the relationship between the United States and China and our legitimate interests with Taiwan. They get too caught up, and a desk officer or somebody lower down the chain cannot forcefully argue for the importance of the relationship. It needs to be elevated in meaningful ways and maintained there so that it can bridge Democrats into Republicans into Democrats, because there's surely support on both sides. This isn't a partisan issue.
Hopefully, Senate willing, that type of leadership might end up in the Department of Defense.
Mazel tov.
I wanted to open up the floor to our audience. We have a really nice, healthy half an hour, so please pepper us with all the questions you might have. There are microphones coming around. If you can just state your name and affiliation, and that'd be great. Up in the front.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for this panel presentation. When I think about unification or self-determination or even security, I'm thinking about for the public interest, whether it's public safety or whether it's economic well-being. I mean well-being, and not just GMP. So I just wonder if there's anything we can say, whether public opinions, whether they think they would prefer unification or they would prefer self-determination, and whether the public safety is stronger in which society, and whether cultural differences, like mainland China, they are anti-corruption. In the United States, they say drain the swamp, but nobody do really anything. I just wonder if Taiwan is doing better, and so people feel better, and then there's no corruption, so people will like to live happily, whether in mainland China or in Taiwan.
Is your question?
My question is, can you address this type of issues from the public safety and social problem? Like democracy in the United States is really, there's some vote, but a lot of high percentage of non-voters, and besides, elections is really rigged.
I think your question is
rigged. I just wanted to know, as a person who want to where to live, where system they want to live, to choose, we have to address this type of social issues.
Okay. Saying when to tackle. I think the question that she was asking is talking about public opinion, I guess in Taiwan and the United States, and kind of the state of democracy, perhaps in the United States and Taiwan. Anyone want to talk about that? Mark?
I can't address I'm American, so I can't address what the perspective from Taiwanese people. But this is actually one of the challenges. I mean, I instinctively, when I mentioned before about my own experience about viewing Taiwan as under its current ROC constitution as an independent sovereign state, that's just my opinion. I personally recognize Taiwan, the ROC, as a state, but understanding there's a difference in policy. And I instinctively believe that the U.S., as a matter of conscious policy, should, in a very careful way, gradually, over 10 years or so, should gradually normalize relations with both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Because U.S., if we don't, when our policy is based on a myth, there's going to be problems. And it's one thing. But the problem in trying to develop an argument about why the U.S. should think through ways to balance, as I often attribute to Russell, the issue of soft balancing. coming up with an argument about why the U.S. from a national security perspective, you say public security, I think public safety, I think you meant national security. Coming up with an argument about why the U.S. should gradually move toward a more normal relationship with both sides of the Taiwan Strait. This is the biggest challenge, coming up with a good reason why. I can come up with three. One, it just goes back to objective reality. Policies are always best if they're based upon a grasp of objective reality. Sometimes we have to adjust a bit, but that's the first reason. It's like applying strategic clarity, as Joe Stiles mentioned. It's applying strategic clarity at a broader level, just being more clear about the legitimacy of both governments. Because if we don't do this, it leads to the second reason. The opportunity cost from not extending legitimacy to Taiwan or ROC and democracy is it undermines the principles that have driven or been a major part of U.S. Foreign policy for centuries. U.S. interests, there's always been a measure of principle involved there in terms of support for democracy and human rights and universal values. If we, on our current definition of one China, which is somewhat zero-sum nature and game, we can only have relations with one side of the Taiwan Strait or the other in terms of formal. From a symbolic perspective, it sends a message. We extend legitimacy to an autocratic government, the Chinese Communist Party, and we withhold legitimacy from a government that has undergone a miraculous transformation from an authoritarian regime to a democracy over the last 30 years or so. And it's amazing. And so there should be more, in my view. The cost of this is that we see it in other parts of the world. With Freedom House, which they talk about a backsliding of democracy in other parts of the world. And if you believe in somewhat of that democracies tends to be, at least more open societies tend to be better, the way in terms of treating their people, tends to result in a more secure environment internationally, then one can make that a national security argument. Third, if we're sincere about creating the environment in which the democratically elected government on Taiwan, for example, in Taiwan, if we're sincere about establishing, not necessarily getting involved between the two sides, but providing the conditions in which democratic leaders on Taiwan can engage your counterpart in some sort of political dialogue, then if we're sincere about that, then we should do more to balance things in terms of our extension of legitimacy to both sides. It's not just about, bear in mind what arms sales are. Arms sales are not just weapons and things that, explosives. But what Beijing doesn't like most about arms sales, especially submarines and advanced fighters, is what they mean in terms of legitimacy. Every congressional notification, it's not just the weapon system, but it's what they mean in terms of U.S. policy on one China.
And we'll take a group. Let's start in the back.
Hi, Dave Brown from SICE. I want to thank all the panelists for very thoughtful remarks. I would like to make some comments on Tiffany's comments concerning coercion. And you very correctly laid out the panoply of measures that Beijing has taken in the diplomatic, economic, military field against President Tsai over the last 15 months. And in the second part, you sort of hinted at their limited effectiveness. I think they have been quite ineffective. They have not changed Madam Tsai's policy. They have not led to the DPP internally generating pressure on her to change that policy. They have not led to a major shift in public opinion in Taiwan in favor of the KMT. They haven't even led to the KMT adopting more pro-Beijing policies. Quite the contrary. At its August conference, the KMT rejected the Hungshuju's policy. So I think in talking about coercion, we should be careful to do what you did in the second part of your speech, to underline that these measures have not been effective in trying to move Taiwan in the direction of a more pro-unification policy. When we only talk about the PRC's coercion, yes, it generates a certain amount of sympathy here in the United States. But in effect, with respect to Taiwan, we're magnifying, we're enabling PRC conversion by talking about it too much. We should always, when we talk about their coercion, indicate whether we think it's effective or not. So that's part of a counter-coercion strategy. The other part is when we see that kind of coercion, we should be doing what we can to bolster confidence within Taiwan. And I think the administration and the Congress has been doing quite a lot on that front. If you look at the number of senior administration officials, the number of congressional delegations that have been going to Taiwan, these are all positive things. The Global Cooperation and Training Framework is an important element of support. So these are comments about your remarks, and I apologize for not having a question.
Well, Dr. Brown, thank you so much. And I do agree with you that the current assessment is that the coercion has not had their intended effect. It didn't work in 95, 96. It's perhaps not working now in the short term. One thing I was a little cautious of in thinking about this issue of the effectiveness of coercion is looking out to the long term, where we do see that the PRC's ability to execute military coercion is perhaps projected to increase, whether we're talking about sort of quantitative and qualitative improvements when the PLA, better training, better amphibious landing capabilities, possibly a more effective force after the reorganization. But I think to the question that I think Rachel asked me earlier and what she was trying to get at, I think the key for Taiwan and the United States is to keep denying the PRC's success in their coercion strategies. And really the answer to that was everything that was kind of brought up early in this panel, all the different ways that we can deepen the relationship across the board. And for Taiwan to do what is good for itself is actually the best counter-coercion strategy it has. I mean, Taiwan's existence as a unique entity and will continue to be the best form of counter-coercion.
And Garrett?
Hi, Garrett van der Wees, former editor of Taiwan Communique. Thanks very much for really an excellent panel. Each of the presentations was just fantastic. Most of you touched on one topic that's very close to my heart, and that's the submarines. One comment in the direction of Anish, you did visit the Guppy. That is only being used for training. The two operational submarines they do have are actually Dutch submarines, which are quite effective. I think they're going through a midlife upgrade at the present time, but are still pretty potent weapons. So hopefully they can go another few years. The question was to Rupert. You indicated, I thought I had understood you as saying that the IDS can only get off the ground. Well, submarine getting off the ground, I'd like to see that. But if a U.S. company is chosen as prime contractor, is that correct, or am I misunderstanding you there? Or is it the case of the licenses coming through and then Taiwan can go ahead as it's presently planned, or is there a difference there?
All right, thanks, Garrett. I appreciate the question. I know Mark's itching to get involved at the other end. I can see him just squirming in his seat. It's my personal opinion that if Taiwan is going to produce a platform that delivers from an asymmetric defense standpoint, there needs to be a significant role for the U.S. Ideally, that the systems integrator is a U.S. company. I believe that maximizes the chance of success if Taiwan goes down that path. I suspect my friend to my right is going to argue that Taiwan can produce one irrespective of U.S. involvement, one way or the other. But I do believe that U.S. involvement is critical to the success of this program.
As Rupert correctly predicted, my view is that this program is much farther down the road than we think that it may be. Let me give an example. This is Taiwan, a fairly detailed breakout of Taiwan's overall central government spending in for next year, 2018. Pretty detailed. It's amazingly. how much transparency Taiwan has. I'm seeing in here they've had this current IDS program has two phases. There's a design phase, and then there's the construction phase. For a design phase, 3 years. I'm looking at this year, NT. Let me see. Actually, for US 300 million, and this is starting last year. My understanding is that it's pretty far along, and my concern more has to do with we're losing business. Europeans, my understanding, there has been precedence of European companies that have been involved in Taiwan's domestic defense program under contract with China Shipbuilding or Taiwan Shipbuilding. I forgot what they're called these days, but the guys down in Kaohsiung, there's been a European company that's been involved in this ever since early 2000. And there are contracts that are being let all the time. Europeans have different, my understanding, some different laws having to do with export controls. U.S. side, you need a license just to do correct me if I'm wrong, but even marketing, much less engineering consulting or program management. And my view is that European, they're all over this, and we're still sitting in the same position we've been sitting for years and just not, and losing out.
I was going to mention, if you weren't going to mention program management, I was going to bring it up, because if you've taught me anything, Mark, it's that the U.S. has a role to play in licenses and program management in Taiwan's IDS program. So, are there any last questions? Yes, Colby.
Hi, my name's Colby Furlan, unaffiliated, but I went to GW here, and I actually just moved back from a year and a half living and working in Taiwan. And Tiffany Ma mentioned hearts and minds, and the problem that the PRC is probably having with the narrative of the one country, two systems, given that. And from watching local TV over there for that time, one thing that was a really big issue was the problem of pro-democracy activists being abducted from semi-autonomous regions in mainland China like Macau or Hong Kong. And also in 2016, when I was still there, there was issues, I think, from Africa, people being deported to mainland China. I'm just curious, and this question is for anyone really, what's the potential for that issue? Do you see that happening a lot more? What's the potential for that to culminate in a major security issue? And what's the U.S.'s role when we see those kind of issues on TV? Because I never got that perspective.
Well, I'd certainly hope that the United States would take a role in opposing having Taiwan citizens, taken from a third country and sent to China as opposed to Taiwan. That would certainly be an opportunity for the U.S. to question due process in China and how people are handled, fairly or unfairly. So I think there's an opportunity there for the U.S. to clearly frame its view on the rights of global citizens and its concerns regarding how those are practiced in the mainland. So anyway, I would just leave that.
Colby, thanks so much for your question. So I think the cases that you describe are sort of very much part of this sort of psychological warfare, coercion that the mainland is using against against Taiwan. I think in terms of a response to it, I mean, we saw just, I think today, the news that the Taiwanese activist Li Mingche was sentenced in China, and the whole thing has been a very politicized case. It's been very much speculated. This is one of the ways that Beijing is trying to pressure Taiwan, and and that's sort of part of a broader push to show its dissatisfaction with the current administration. And I think there's a few ways to push back on it. I think one of which is, we have to talk about the issue of transparency in China's judicial system. And that is perhaps not a new issue, but one that the United States could potentially take up. And I think there is potentially a role for the United States in private diplomatic measures in trying to resolve some of these cases. I mean, I'm not aware of what has happened. I would assume that perhaps it would have come up in some discussions.
And I think one other thing to add to both Rupert and Tiffany, it's not really something that we explicitly spoke about in today's panel. I think the component of human rights as being really a part of U.S. vision, U.S. strategy globally, not just in Asia. And I think human rights has a strong role to play when it comes to security. We brought up the security relations, U.S.-Taiwan security relations really is not just about the military. It's not just about arms sales. It's about the greater things, the economy, the social political environment, and human rights and freedom of value, freedom of expression, self-determination, that's all components of security. And so I think continuing to have a values-based strategy, U.S. should continue to have a values-based strategy abroad, and then work with other countries that are like-minded. That is a strong security component to all of this. And so I think for the U.S. to continue to bring up human rights to China, in my view, in a more visible way, I think would be a plus. And I think for U.S. and Taiwan to work together on human rights promotion in the Asia Pacific region could also be a plus, either through things like the GCFT, or working with Japan on human rights. I think those are all really strong components. Getting like-minded Asian democracies working together on these issues is important, and that should be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, in my opinion.
Tiff, can I? Oh yeah, after.
Just a very quick two-finger intervention here. Anytime you mention the word universal values, human rights, I think United Nations. I mean, it's a function the United Nations should be playing. Is it coincidental that just last week there was an arrest of Secretary General of something called the China Energy Fund Committee in New York City, arrest for corruption of former UN Secretary General. I'm sorry, UN General Assembly President. The individual, a prominent member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee, part of the United Front system, operating apparently in New York City. He was just passing through en route to a conference here in Washington, D.C. Obviously, he didn't make it. But is it coincidental that he's the second individual? Earlier this year, there was actually in 2015, an arrest of another individual, ostensibly Macau, but also affiliated with the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee, that was arrested and convicted early this year, bribery for another former UN General Assembly President, John Ash. Is this coincidental? Is it any wonder that UN now doesn't allow ROC passport holders to tourists to even step foot in the UN? Is it any wonder right now that UN has been deadly silent on anything having to do with Taiwan? Is this coincidental? I would argue it's not, and it goes directly to sort of a real problem in the United Nations in terms of their traditional support for human rights and universal values.
And also looking at, I think the China-affiliated NGOs that are the UN NGOs, I think relooking at that list as well is also an important component that the U.S. UN office should be looking at. Did you have another comment? I know we have 3 minutes. So I'm going to try and wow, there's so many more questions now. I'll take Russell in the back, and then we'll also go to Janice.
Thank you. Russell Shell with the Global Taiwan Institute. Thank you for an excellent set of presentations. My question is for Anish. Both Ambassador Lee and Randy suggested that Taiwan has a role to play in the Indo-Pacific strategy that the Trump administration has outlined in the past month or so. What role do you see Taiwan potentially playing in this strategy? And do you see it, how does it contribute to perhaps cross-strait stability? And welcome you to comment and the other commentators, presenters to comment as well.
And Janice?
I'm, you hear me? Janice from the Taiwan DPP U.S. mission. My question is also for Anish, saving the best for last. But thank you very much for your insights into the NDA process. I think we always wonder a little bit, what are the negotiations that go on, especially in the conference phase. And I think I just want to kind of say that, as I've observed this over the past several years, I think it's been interesting to see that the language relating to Taiwan in the NDA has really evolved from, if you look several years back, a lot of it was kind of trying to dictate sale of certain arms. And then a couple years ago, we started to see more creative thinking about participation in joint exercises and military officer exchanges. And this year, there was really a lot of innovative thinking. And I just wonder if you have any comments on what function that process plays in kind of the dialogue between Congress and the executive branch. So even though the final language is not as strong as the Senate version initially, how that might influence how DoD looks at these issues and maybe try to push the issues forward over the long term. Thanks.
All right, I guess I'm up.
On U.S.-Taiwan security relations, and there was no question on what will be in the next arms sales package. which I find to be a question that people often ask at other U.S.-Taiwan security conferences. But as we kind of come to a close, I wanted to hit on a point, and going back to David Helvey's remarks, again, from U.S.-Taiwan Business Conference, he ended on, and this is from his speech, he said, a resilient deterrent is networked, survivable, and adaptive. And I think he had particular meanings and what he meant by that, but I kind of took those questions and it brought these three rhetorical ones. How can the US and Taiwan be more networked? So how can our governments be more networked? How can our militaries be more networked? Our industries, our economies? How can US-Taiwan relations be survivable against Chinese coercion? And how can US-Taiwan relations be adaptable? And how can our relations evolve? Kind of what Mark was saying, how can our relations evolve to be more in line with our values, to be more in line with a free and open rules-based order, more in line with the legitimacy of a democratically elected government? So with that, I kind of close. Please give me a hand in thanking my panelists up here today. And this, perhaps, no Senate willing, this might be Randy Shriver's last Project 2049 conference, but thank you guys for coming out today. I really appreciate it.